Hey gang, I'm over here for a special episode on the Main Street Randy Land YouTube channel. Hooray! You know, it's funny how different days play different parts in our lives. I woke up today and I saw on my Facebook feed an interesting article. And the article, I'm trying to bring it up on my other phone here. The article goes back to 1969. And I'm going to try to zoom in on my other camera here. You see this? U.S. puts 2 men on the moon. Look at that. Front page news. And this was on July the 20th of 1969. You know, I was 8 years old in 1969. My birthday is in October, so in July I was still 8 years old. I was born in 1960. I remember seeing that on the TV and what a big deal it was in, all the newspapers and the, breaking in special news on the television. And I remember even at 8 years old, I said, that doesn't sound right to me. So everybody was just in awe of it, and the presentations were just so amazing that, we accomplished such a thing. But I didn't believe it, even when I was 8 years old. I remember later on in school, when they talked about it, and they had different, moon landings, in the future. And I said to the teacher, I says, teacher, how come they needed this big giant rocket to take off from the Earth, but only this little module can just spring up from the moon without the rocket thrust? How could that be? And the teacher said, oh, well, you're stupid. The Earth has 6 times more gravity than the moon. Well, then you need a rocket that is 1/6 the size. You don't need no rocket. You can't just spring up from, a retrofire and a big spring underneath it or something of this nature. It just defies common sense logic. So people are swept up with the idea that, we went to the moon, man must be great, we can do all these wonderful things. And people would like to believe that man can do things possibly that we really can't do. So I don't believe the moon landing was real. I believe it was a presentation to make us believe that we went to the moon. So, oh, that's ridiculous. You're a conspiracy theorist. Well, no, I'm a technical guy. I'm analytical. And I look at things and I say to myself, if something doesn't seem right, perhaps there's a reason for it. And you look into it a little more in depth, and here we are all these years later, and we have the advantage of seeing repeat broadcasts via the internet that we never really had that opportunity to do before. And I guess they didn't figure anybody would have the ability to copy videotapes back in that day, but TV stations apparently did, and they have those live broadcasts. And if you look at them, they just don't make sense. Just on the premise alone that you're talking 1969, we're not talking a period where we all had cell phones in our camera, or our cameras in our cell phones that we can just carry along in our pocket with these high-powered batteries that last forever, that we can take these great images. This is something that's rather new in technology. You're going back a lot of years here. So what were cameras like in the 60s? Well, nobody had a video camera. I mean, household people didn't have video cameras. So only TV studios had video cameras. Well, what was a TV studio video camera like? Did they have little tiny cameras in their phones that they were able to, take great pictures from? No. Here are some cameras in my collection. These cameras are from the 60s, possibly into the 70s, and these are studio cameras, and these are the type of cameras you would find where they're doing their broadcasting. They're on big, heavy pedestals because they weigh hundreds of pounds. They're not light by any means. I could not lift one of these cameras by myself. It would be too heavy for me, and I'm a strong guy. Now, you'll see on the sides of these cameras, they have these built-in handles. They all have them. It's on both sides, and that's so 2 people can lift this heavy camera up to put it onto this mounting bracket, onto this heavy pedestal, which is extremely heavy, and inside these pedestals are counterweights so that they can be moved up and down. So when you're shooting a rocket to the moon and you're worried about weight, how could you carry big, heavy cameras in order to shoot back video for the nation and the world to see? Well, you're silly, they had smaller versions of these things. Well, yeah, they did have some smaller versions. Maybe they weren't as high quality as the broadcast studio cameras were, but you're going to the moon. You want to get, good quality pictures. Up here is a 60s camera that is smaller, but you know what? It's not small. Here, hold my camera up to it. These things are still big, and it has a decent amount of weight to it. And they use real TV screen viewfinders, not little LCDs in your camera. So these viewfinders alone, they weigh a lot that you're putting onto the camera. Oh, well, they didn't have viewfinders on their cameras. Well, I guess that's true because they couldn't see through a viewfinder holding that camera in front of their stomach in a spacesuit with a big shield on their head. They wouldn't be able to see a viewfinder. So how did they center the pictures? Did they just hold their camera? It was mounted to the front of their spacesuit, big bulky spacesuit, and they were able to know just how to zero in on somebody? These things defy logic and common sense. So I don't believe that they took giant broadcast cameras up to the moon. I don't believe they took miniature versions of them in that day, which weren't really that small, and the resolution would not have been so good. But in addition to that, these cameras, they pull a good deal of electrical current in order to operate. These are not small. They take a lot of current. Now, these cameras actually run, they have actual outlet plugs here, where they can feed out 110. They run on a lot of electricity, whether they're 12 volts, 24 volts converted down. They're not pulling just a little bit of current. So what powered those cameras? Well, they must have had batteries. They brought batteries with them. Do you know how heavy batteries are? Did you ever take your car battery out of the car? It's heavy, right? It's hard to lift it out of that spot because it's heavy. And a car battery wouldn't run a camera like this very long. It would run it, but not that long a period of time. Okay, so that brings the next factor. They broadcasted live signal from the moon so we could all see on television across the world. Do you know how much energy it takes to transmit a video signal and an audio signal? Because they're two different signals, mind you. Video and audio signal transmitted from the moon to Earth. 1969, I lived in Short Hills, New Jersey, which was 20 miles from New York City, the mecca of transmitters on the top of the Empire State Building and later on the World Trade Center. We couldn't get a good TV signal if it was, the slightest bit of rain outside or cloudy or whatever. You didn't get a good signal. You got snow. You had to have a big antenna on your roof, constantly changing it. Poor broadcast signal. But we got transmission clear from the moon. Oh, this guy's an idiot. They had big satellite dishes set up to capture that signal. Yeah, we did. And we focused in on the transmitters that were coming in, and we were able to boost the signal in that fashion, but not to that degree. You still require a large amount of electrical current in order to transmit video and audio signals any kind of a distance. And here we are transmitting from big cameras, pulling a lot of power. We're transmitting a signal for a prolonged nature of time coming from the moon. Interesting. How did they do that? must have had an awful lot of batteries. Well, that weighs an awful lot. So how did we get off of the moon? If we got up there, and you believe that premise with the giant rockets, and we landed in orbit and eventually descended to the surface, how did we get off the surface? Did you ever see those videos where the lunar module springs up from the moon? Where's the retrofire underneath it? Where's the rocket fire? Where's the blast underneath it? And it wouldn't just spring up out of nowhere. And if it did spring up like that, anybody inside would be, their brain would crush the back of their skull. So these things just don't add up. I don't believe we ever went to the moon. The idea that we would send human beings to land on a moon with no plan to rescue them whatsoever if something went wrong, and something could very easily go wrong in a situation like that, would be completely irresponsible. So would we have really risked people's lives to that degree to send them up to land on the moon if they landed on the moon and be marooned on the moon? I don't think so. Yes, explorers, they're heroes. They go to, you know what? People aren't total idiots. If they don't see a realistic plan for them to come through this alive, they're not doing this. So what were we doing? We were sending up these rockets. Everybody saw the rockets going up. Well, in 1960s, early 60s, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis with Cuba and Kennedy. We were on the brink of a nuclear war with Russia. It was a Cold War. So people were very, very much afraid of a nuclear war and didn't want to begin anything, any kind of escalation. So how do you explain these rockets going up unless they're going up for a purpose of humanity going to the moon? Perhaps those rockets weren't going up to go to the moon. Maybe we were putting rockets up in orbit and placing spy satellites over other countries. But if we did that and told the general public we were putting spy satellites, that would be looked upon as an aggression, an act of aggression, pushing us towards a possible conflict in the end of the world through nuclear warfare. So instead of being aggressors putting up spy satellites over other countries looking down at what they're doing, suddenly we're not aggressors putting up spy satellites. We are heroes going to the moon. And everybody cheers, and here comes the flags and the confetti parades for the heroes coming back because they returned from the moon. But suppose they really never went there. I don't think we did. These cameras here, they tell me that nobody went to the moon because they're too big. Then you get into the factor of gravity. Don't get me started. People think that gravity is this invisible magnetic field that's pulling everything down. There's no such thing. It's nonsense. Gravity is not a magnetic field pulling everything down. We are being pressed down. We're not being pulled down. There's a major difference there. Yes, there's an attraction that makes things stick down to the surface. But it's not because we're being pulled down. We're being pressed down because of an atmosphere that we have above us that is landing and pressing us down. And what's holding the atmosphere? The fact that we are displacing an area of space, which is not an empty vacuum of nothing, as everybody tells you. Well, of course it is. Space is an empty vacuum of nothing. Why? Because somebody told you that? Well, people can't see air either, but it's there. So science that's taught perhaps is not always truthful. People believe in false science. They believe it because that's what they're taught. But sometimes you have to question what you're taught and believe, you know what, maybe that's not exactly right. So gravity, as everything is held down, is not being pulled down, it's being pressed down because we are displacing an area of density, which is space. It's not a big density, but space is so large that we are displacing it. And the fact that all planets and moons and asteroids are basically round, that proves the fact that space is not an empty vacuum of nothing. So there's today's science lesson from the world of Randy and the facts of reality of analytical reasoning. And on this day where they tell you that we landed on the moon in 1969, my cameras say otherwise. Do you believe it? You got your opinions. Place them in the comments. We'll see you next time. The Main Street Randyland YouTube channel. We never went to the moon.